a wooden stake, a boiling cauldron, an iron cage, a whip made from animal hide, a metal device forced into a prisoner's mouth, and a poisonous nut that was supposed to decide whether a person was innocent. These were not objects hidden inside criminal workshops. They were instruments of royal law. Ancient Assyria, around 880 BC, a king ordered the bodies of defeated rebels to be displayed outside their own city. Rome, AD 64. An emperor turned public executions into nighttime entertainment. England, 1532. A king changed the law so that one particular prisoner could be boiled to death. Scotland, 1591. A woman accused of witchcraft was locked inside an iron mouthpiece before being questioned by the king himself. Russia, 1698. Rebel soldiers were beaten with a weapon called the knout, before more than 1,000 of them were executed. Madagascar, during the 1800s, people were forced to swallow poison. Surviving meant innocence, dying meant guilt. And in the Congo, a king who rarely visited Africa created a system where rubber was collected through hostages, whips, guns, and severed hands. These rulers lived in different centuries, but they all understood the same dark truth. Punishment does not only hurt the person receiving it. When it is performed in public, it frightens everyone watching. This is the history of kings who did not simply punish their enemies. They turned punishment into a message. The history of the world's strangest kings. Ashurnasirpal II, the king who wrote his cruelty on palace walls. Kalhu, Assyria, around 879 BC, more than 2,800 years ago, King Ashurnasirpal II ruled the Neo-Assyrian Empire. His capital was Kalhu, a city now known as Nimrud, near modern Mosul in Iraq. Ashurnasirpal did not hide the violence used to build his empire. He advertised it. His royal inscriptions described cities being burned, prisoners being impaled, and rebel leaders being skinned. The process of removing a person's skin was called flaying. It was performed using a sharp blade, sometimes described simply as a flaying knife. The king's inscriptions claimed that skins were placed over city walls and that prisoners were displayed on wooden stakes. This was not violence committed in secret. The bodies became part of the city's appearance. A person approaching the gates would understand the message before meeting a single Assyrian soldier. Rebellion had a visible price. Ashurnasirpal also decorated his palace with stone carvings showing battles, sieges, and defeated enemies. The palace was not simply a royal home. It was a building designed to control visitors. Foreign officials walking through its rooms saw the king surrounded by weapons, gods, and conquered people. Every wall said the same thing: the king always wins. His own inscriptions may exaggerate some events. Ancient kings often made themselves appear more powerful than they really were. But the important fact is that Ashurnasirpal wanted people to believe these punishments had happened. Fear itself was one of his weapons. Ashurnasirpal ruled from 883 to 859 BC, and Assyrian images and inscriptions provide some of the earliest clear evidence of rulers using impalement and flaying as public political terror. But Assyrian kings controlled what people saw. More than 6 centuries later, an emperor in China tried to control something even more powerful: what people were allowed to remember. Qin Shi Huang, the emperor who punished people for remembering the past. Xianyang, China, 213 BC. In 221 BC, Qin Shi Huang united several fighting kingdoms and became the first emperor of China. He standardized money, measurements, and writing. But creating one empire was not enough. The emperor also wanted one version of history. In 213 BC, his chief minister, Li Si, recommended destroying texts that could be used to compare the new government with earlier rulers. The order targeted many historical and philosophical works. Books about medicine, farming, and divination were generally protected. But people keeping forbidden texts could face serious punishment. A later account of the order described tattooing as one punishment. This was not decorative tattooing. A permanent mark was cut or burned into the face or body, showing that the person had been convicted. After being marked, offenders could be sent into forced labor, including work connected with northern fortifications. The reported decree also threatened people who used old texts to criticize the present. The punishment could extend beyond the speaker to members of the family. In other words, the government did not only punish an opinion. It could punish the bloodline of the person who expressed it. A famous later story claims that in 212 BC, 460 scholars were buried alive. Modern historians doubt that exact version. The Chinese word in the original account may have meant that the men were trapped and killed, rather than literally placed alive inside graves. The victims may also have included magicians and alchemists who had failed to produce immortality medicines, rather than only Confucian scholars. The book Burning is much better supported than the traditional story of mass live burial. But even without the legend, the policy was terrifying. The first emperor tried to make criticism dangerous by destroying the material people needed to compare him with the past. Qin Shi Huang used punishment to control memory. Rome's Emperor Nero would use it for something different. Entertainment. Nero, the emperor who used people as nighttime lights. Rome, July AD 64. On the night of 18 July AD 64, a fire began near Rome's Circus Maximus. It burned for days. Large parts of the city were destroyed. Rumors spread that Emperor Nero had ordered the fire. There is no solid proof that he did. Nero was outside Rome when it began, and ancient historian Tacitus wrote that the true cause was uncertain. But Nero needed someone to blame. He chose a small and unpopular religious community, the Christians. Tacitus wrote that Christians were arrested and killed using punishments designed to entertain the public. Some were covered with animal skins and attacked by dogs. Others were fastened to wooden crosses. But the strangest punishment happened after sunset. Prisoners were covered with material that could burn and set on fire so that their bodies provided light during the night. The place was not a dark underground prison. The executions were carried out in Nero's gardens. The emperor reportedly opened the area to spectators and appeared among the crowd, dressed like a chariot driver. The instrument was simple, a wooden post or cross, rope or iron fastenings, and fire. But Nero had turned it into theater. Even Tacitus, who was hostile towards Christians, wrote that people began to feel sorry for them. The public believed they were not being killed for the safety of Rome. They were being killed to satisfy the cruelty of one man. Tacitus wrote his account several decades later, and historians still debate parts of the persecution. But his description remains the main ancient source connecting Nero with executions after the Great Fire. Nero's victims became burning objects in a royal performance. 14 centuries later, a ruler in Eastern Europe discovered an even slower way to create fear: the stake. Vlad III, the ruler who built a forest of stakes. Targoviste, Wallachia, 1462. Vlad III ruled Wallachia, a region in present-day Romania. History remembers him as Vlad the Impaler. His Romanian nickname, Teeps, is connected to the word for stake. The instrument used in his most famous executions was a long wooden pole. The victim was placed onto the sharpened stake, which was then raised vertically. Death could take a long time. The punishment had two purposes. The first was execution. The second was display. Vlad used impalement against criminals, political enemies, captured soldiers, and people accused of betraying him. However, many stories about him were printed by German-speaking enemies and merchants who had political reasons to make him appear inhuman. The enormous claim that he impaled tens of thousands of people should not be accepted without question. Recent historical research suggests that some medieval pamphlets greatly increased the numbers. But the basic fact is not disputed: Vlad used impalement deliberately and publicly. In 1462, Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II entered Wallachia with a large army. Near the capital, Targoviste, Ottoman soldiers reportedly found captured men displayed on stakes. The scene became known as the Forest of the Impaled. Its exact size is uncertain, but the psychological purpose is clear. Vlad could not defeat the much larger Ottoman Empire through numbers alone, so he attempted to defeat its soldiers through fear. On 17 June 1462, he also launched a night attack against Mehmed's camp near Targoviste. Vlad failed to kill the Sultan, but his use of surprise attacks, burned supplies, and public executions helped create the image of a ruler whose territory was dangerous even after its towns appeared empty. He did not invent impalement, but his name became permanently connected to the instrument. Vlad used an old punishment so often that it became his identity. In England, King Henry VIII created a new punishment for one specific type of crime, and one specific prisoner. Henry VIII, the king who made boiling a legal execution. Smithfield, London, April 1532. In February 1531, a man named Richard Roos was accused of poisoning food inside the home of John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester. Fisher did not eat the food, but 2 other people died and several became seriously ill. Henry VIII had a deep fear of poisoning. Instead of allowing Roos to face an ordinary murder trial, Parliament passed a law treating murder by poison as high treason. The punishment was not hanging, it was death by boiling. The instrument was a large metal cauldron. On 15 April 1532, Richard Roos was taken to Smithfield in London. Contemporary reports say he was placed into boiling liquid in front of a crowd. The execution was so disturbing that even people used to public punishment were horrified. Henry's law was used again in 1542 against a woman named Margaret Davy. It was repealed after Henry's death, but boiling was not the only unusual royal execution connected to him. On the 19th of May 1536, his second wife, Anne Boleyn, was executed inside the Tower of London. English executions normally used an axe. For Anne, an expert swordsman was brought from Calais. The instrument was a heavy two-handed execution sword. Unlike an axe, it did not require the victim to place her head on a wooden block. Anne remained kneeling upright. The sword was considered a faster and perhaps more respectful method. 6 years later, Henry's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, was executed with the more traditional axe. Under Henry VIII, the instrument could communicate status. A common criminal might be hanged, a poisoner could be boiled, and a queen could receive a specially imported sword. Henry turned the law into a weapon shaped for the individual. Only a few decades later, a Russian Tsar created an entire organization to punish anyone he suspected. Ivan the Terrible, the Tsar who gave terror its own army. Novgorod, Russia, January 1570. In 1565, Tsar Ivan IV divided Russia. One section remained under normal government. Another section came under Ivan's direct control. This system was called the Oprichnina. Its agents were called oprichniki. They acted as Ivan's personal police, soldiers, and executioners. Later stories claim that some carried a dog's head and a broom on their saddles. The dog represented hunting down treason. The broom represented sweeping it away. Historians debate how common these objects really were. But the terror created by the oprichniki is well documented. In late 1569, Ivan became convinced that the city of Novgorod was planning to join Lithuania. Modern historians generally believe the evidence for this conspiracy was extremely weak. In January 1570, Ivan and his oprichniki entered the city. For several weeks, homes, churches, and monasteries were searched and robbed. People were questioned under torture. Some were executed in public. Chronicles describe prisoners being tied to sledges and pushed into the freezing Volkhov River. Others were reportedly killed on the riverbank if they attempted to escape from the water. The exact number of victims remains uncertain. Older chronicles gave enormous numbers that were probably impossible for the city's population. Modern estimates are generally lower, often in the thousands rather than tens of thousands. But the destruction was real. Novgorod lost people, food, property, and political power. Ivan had used a rumor of treason to attack one of Russia's most important cities. His most effective instrument was not a blade, it was suspicion. Nobody knew what action, letter, or accusation might make the Tsar consider them disloyal. Ivan hunted political treason. Scotland's King James VI hunted an enemy that could not even be proven to exist: witches. James VI, the king who personally questioned witches. Edinburgh, Scotland, 1590 to 1591. In 1589, King James VI of Scotland traveled to Denmark to collect his new wife, Anne. The royal journey faced dangerous storms. People began claiming that witches had created the bad weather to kill the king. The result was the North Berwick witch trials, beginning in 1590. Dozens of people were accused. Many confessions were produced through torture. One of the most famous victims was Agnes Sampson, a respected healer from East Lothian. She denied the accusations. Her interrogators shaved her hair, prevented her from sleeping, and placed an iron device around her head. This instrument is commonly described as a witch's bridle or scold's bridle. It was an iron frame with a metal piece that entered the mouth. Some versions contained spikes or sharp points that pressed against the tongue and cheeks. The device made speaking painful and sometimes impossible. After prolonged torture, Agnes confessed. She was brought before King James. At first, the king had reportedly doubted parts of her story. But after she repeated private details connected to him and his wife, he became convinced. On the 28th of January 1591, Agnes Sampson was taken to Castle Hill in Edinburgh. She was strangled and then her body was burned. Another accused man, schoolmaster John Fian, was also tortured and executed. James later wrote a book called Demonology, published in 1597, supporting belief in witchcraft and the prosecution of witches. The strange part of these trials was not only the equipment, it was the logic. Torture produced a confession. The confession justified the torture. And the king's belief transformed impossible stories into legal evidence. James used iron and fear to force stories from prisoners. A century later, Peter the Great would use torture not to find witches, but to force Russia into the modern world. Peter the Great, the Tsar, who tortured the old Russia out of his soldiers. Moscow, September 1698. Peter, I wanted to rebuild Russia using ideas he had seen in Western Europe. But one old military group stood in his way. The Streltsy were armed regiments originally created during the 16th century. In 1698, while Peter was traveling in Europe, several Streltsy regiments rebelled. The rebellion was defeated before Peter returned. 57 leaders had already been hanged. Peter believed the first investigation had not gone far enough. A second investigation began. The most famous instrument used was the knout. A knout was a heavy whip made from twisted leather. A powerful strike could tear the skin, damage muscles, and leave a person permanently injured. Repeated blows could be fatal. Other prisoners faced thumbscrews, metal devices tightened around the fingers. Accounts also describe stretching devices and heated iron pincers. Torture was used to produce names and confessions. Between September 1698 and February 1699, records indicate that 1182 Streltsy were executed. Hundreds of others were whipped, branded, or exiled. Bodies were publicly displayed around Moscow. Some accounts claim Peter personally took part in beheadings. That detail remains debated, but he directly controlled the investigation and executions. Peter also punished appearance. In 1698, he began forcing elite Russian men to remove traditional long beards. From 1705, men who wished to keep their beards could be required to pay a tax. Those who paid received a small metal object called a beard token. The token proved that the beard was legal. One of Peter's punishments destroyed the body. The other controlled how the body was allowed to look. Both carried the same message: the Tsar would decide what the new Russia should become. Peter punished rebels over many months. In Delhi, Nader Shah ordered a punishment that lasted only a few hours. But it killed thousands. Nader Shah, the ruler who punished an entire city, Delhi. 22 March 1739, Nader Shah ruled Persia and built one of the most powerful armies of his age. In February 1739, he defeated the Mughal army at the Battle of Karnal. He then entered Delhi with Mughal Emperor Muhammad Shah. At first, the occupation remained controlled. Then on the 22 March, a rumor spread through the city that Nader Shah had been killed. Residents attacked Persian soldiers in different areas. Nader was alive. When he learned about the attacks, he ordered his troops to punish the city. Persian soldiers moved through the streets with swords, muskets, and knives. The killing continued for several hours. Exact numbers are impossible to confirm, but many historians estimate that between 20,000 and 30,000 people were killed. Men, women, and children were caught in the violence. Homes and shops were robbed. The city was then forced to surrender enormous amounts of gold, silver, and jewels. Nader Shah carried away the famous peacock throne and treasures associated with the Mughal court. What made the punishment unusual was its size. Nader did not identify and try individual attackers. He treated the population of Delhi as one guilty body, one rumor, one order, thousands of deaths. The massacre also demonstrated how quickly control could collapse inside a crowded city. Hours earlier, Delhi had been occupied but functioning. By the end of the day, entire neighborhoods had been transformed. The figures remain disputed, but contemporary and later accounts agree that 22 March 1739 became one of the darkest days in Delhi's history. Nader Shah judged a city through collective punishment. In Madagascar, guilt could be decided by something even less reliable: whether a person's body could survive poison. Rana Valona I, the queen whose poison decided innocence. Antananarivo, Madagascar, 1828. 1861 Rana Valona I became queen of the Kingdom of Madagascar in 1828. During her reign, an old legal and religious practice became one of the kingdom's most feared tests. It was called the Tangina ordeal. Tangina was a poisonous substance made from the nut of a native tree. A person accused of theft, witchcraft, political disloyalty, or forbidden religious activity could be ordered to swallow it. The process followed a ritual. The accused was fed 3 small pieces of chicken skin. Then the person drank the Tangina mixture. If the accused vomited and all 3 pieces of skin appeared, the person could be declared innocent. If the pieces did not appear, the person was considered guilty. If the person died from the poison, death itself was treated as proof of guilt. In some cases, a dog or rooster was tested before an important noble was forced to drink the mixture. Poorer people and enslaved people were less likely to receive such protection. Tangina did not test honesty. It tested the strength of a person's body, the amount of poison used, and simple chance. Historical estimates suggest that between 20 and 50% of people subjected to some forms of the ordeal died. The number of yearly deaths increased during Rana Valona's reign, although the largest figures reported by 19th century writers remain debated. Tangina was not invented by Rana Valona. It had existed in Madagascar for centuries, but her government maintained it as an important tool of law, religion, and political control. It was officially abolished in 1863, 2 years after her death. For generations, families had to accept a terrifying idea: a dead person was guilty because the test had killed them. Tangina turned poison into a judge. Our final king created something even more dangerous: a punishment system so large that the king did not need to be present when it operated. Leopold II, the king who turned an entire country into a labor camp. Congo Free State, 1885, 1908. Leopold II was king of Belgium. But the Congo Free State was not originally a normal Belgian colony. From 1885, it was effectively Leopold's personal possession. The king claimed that his project would bring trade, development, and an end to slavery. In reality, the territory became a system for extracting ivory and wild rubber. Villages were ordered to meet production quotas. When the rubber did not arrive, armed forces could take hostages, burn homes, beat workers, or kill people. The colonial army was called the Force Publique. One of its most feared instruments was the chicot. The chicot was a whip made from dried hippopotamus hide. It was hard, heavy, and capable of causing deep wounds. Prisoners were often forced to lie on the ground while receiving a fixed number of strokes. Large numbers of strokes could cause unconsciousness or death. The system also produced the most famous symbol of Congo Free State brutality: severed hands. Soldiers were expected to prove that bullets had not been wasted. A right hand taken from a dead person could be used as evidence that a bullet had killed someone. This demand encouraged soldiers to bring back hands after raids. There are also documented cases in which living people were mutilated, although historians debate whether cutting hands from living workers was a formal general policy or a consequence of the ammunition accounting system and wider violence. Either way, the system was created under Leopold's authority and operated for his financial benefit. Missionaries, journalists, and reformers published photographs and eyewitness reports. International pressure finally forced Leopold to surrender control. In 1908, Belgium took over the territory. The exact population loss under Leopold cannot be calculated reliably. Disease, famine, falling birth rates, forced labor, and direct violence all contributed. But the argument over the number does not change the system itself. A king sitting thousands of kilometers away had created a machine in which rubber became more valuable than human life. The most dangerous instrument was the crown: a stake, a tattooing blade, a wooden cross, a boiling cauldron, an execution sword, a witch's bridle, a knout, a tangina nut, and a chicot. Every instrument in this story had a different shape, but they all served the same purpose: to turn the suffering of one person into a warning for thousands of others. Ashurnasirpal placed punishment on city walls. Qin Shi Huang used it to control memory. Nero turned it into entertainment. Vlad turned it into psychological warfare. Henry VIII changed the law to create a new death. Ivan the Terrible built a private force around suspicion. James V allowed torture to create evidence. Peter the Great used pain to force a country to change. Nader Shah treated a whole city as guilty. Ranavalona allowed poison to decide the truth. And Leopold created a system in which people were punished for failing to produce profit. Some of these rulers were intelligent. Some were successful military leaders. Some built roads, palaces, governments, and empires. That is what makes their stories more frightening. Cruelty does not always come from a ruler who has lost control. Sometimes, cruelty is the system of control. A blade could kill one person. A law could destroy thousands. And the most dangerous instrument in the room was not always the stake, the sword, or the whip. Sometimes it was the crown. When no one can question the ruler, punishment becomes whatever the ruler wants it to be.